She chose champagne in Miami over standing beside her father's grave in Maine. And that single choice changed everything. So, how did my sister go from family to stranger in one frozen afternoon? My name is Nayen. I'm an architectural designer by profession, though for the last 3 years, I barely touched a blueprint. Instead, I became a full-time caregiver to my dying father. And today, I want to tell you the story of how I buried him alone, while my sister was busy enjoying poolside parties. The wind coming off Casco Bay cut straight through my coat that afternoon, sharp and merciless, as if winter itself wanted to participate in the goodbye. Dead leaves skittered across the frozen ground of the Portland Cemetery, circling my boots in a quiet, mournful dance. I stood beside my father's grave, with my hands clenched inside my pockets, staring at the simple wooden casket as it was slowly lowered into the earth. Next to me was a folding chair, empty. It had been reserved for my older sister, Heidi. She never showed. The minister rushed through the final prayer because the temperature kept dropping, his breath visible in short white clouds. People shifted uncomfortably, eager to escape the cold. But I didn't move. I didn't cry either. Not because I didn't love my father, but because I had already cried all the tears I had inside me during the 3 long years I spent watching him fade away in a sterile hospital room. 3 years of sleepless nights, morphine schedules, emergency pharmacy runs, and whispered reassurances at 2 in the morning while his hands trembled in mine. 3 years of putting my own life on hold. And 3 years of waiting for Heidi to come home. She never did. After the service ended, I retreated to my car, my fingers stiff as I closed the door and turned on the heater. My phone buzzed in my lap. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe she finally sent a message. Maybe she apologized. Maybe she didn't know. But when I unlocked the screen, my heart sank into something colder than grief. It was an Instagram post. Heidi stood barefoot beside an infinity pool at a 5-star resort in Miami, wearing a designer bikini and holding a champagne flute. Palm trees framed her perfect smile. The caption read, "Life is meant to be enjoyed in the moment. Never let the past hold you back. Cheers to the good times." She posted that exact photo at the exact moment our father's coffin touched frozen dirt. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked older than they had that morning. Something inside my chest hardened, not into rage, but into clarity. In that moment, I understood something with terrifying certainty. Her vacation was about to end, and so was her access to our family's money. If you've ever been betrayed by your own blood, you know that pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it goes quiet. Sometimes it becomes focused. That's what happened to me. The drive home felt longer than usual. The house waited in silence, a massive structure that suddenly felt far too big for one person. When I opened the heavy oak front door, the warmth inside barely registered. The emptiness hit harder. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the echo of my own breathing. This house had been my entire world for 3 years. Every hallway carried memories. Every floorboard remembered my footsteps rushing to his room. The faint smell of disinfectant still lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. I had spent my 30th and 31st birthdays here, feeding him soup, adjusting pillows, helping him sit up when the pain became unbearable. Heidi had spent those same years building her brand in warmer climates. I walked slowly toward the study, the room where my father had spent decades designing buildings, managing investments, and creating the future Heidi now treated like her personal ATM. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses rested on a stack of architectural magazines. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay open on the desk. The green banker's lamp cast a soft glow over the polished mahogany surface. On instinct, I reached for the landscape painting above the fireplace and slid it aside. Behind it was the wall safe. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the combination he had whispered to me 3 days before his heart finally stopped. I hadn't understood then why he insisted I memorize it. The metal door opened with a low groan. I expected cash, jewelry, important documents. Instead, there was only a single black leather notebook sitting alone on the cold steel shelf. I carried it to the desk and opened the cover. The word ledger was embossed on the front in faded gold. At first, I thought it was a journal. It wasn't. It was a meticulous financial record. Every single dollar that had left this house over the past 15 years was documented in my father's careful handwriting, dates, amounts, recipients, reasons, and page after page after page, all pointed to Heidi. $50,000 for a luxury car because she said her old one was unsafe. $20,000 to pay off a stolen credit card annotated later with a quiet note. Nordstrom shopping. $10,000 sent to a bail bondsman in Miami after she told us she was hospitalized with the flu. I felt sick. He hadn't been blind. He had been keeping score. My father had known exactly who she was. And at the back of the ledger, clipped carefully to the final page, was a manila envelope. My name was written across it in bold letters. I opened it slowly. Inside was a notarized letter addressed to me, along with legal documents that would take effect immediately upon his death. Executor of estate. Durable power of attorney. Authority. Suddenly, I understood why he made me memorize that safe code. He wasn't leaving me money. He was leaving me responsibility. And standing alone in that quiet study, with winter pressing against the windows and betrayal written in ink before my eyes, I realized something else. My father had given me the means to protect what he built, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt strength replacing exhaustion. Because Heidi thought she had been draining a helpless old man. She had no idea. She'd been writing her own ending. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my father's study until the sky outside the window faded from black to gray, the ledger resting heavily on my lap like it carried its own gravity. Every page replayed itself in my mind. Every dollar Heidi had taken. Every excuse she had fed us. Every lie my father had quietly swallowed. Grief had exhausted me long ago. What remained was focus. By the time the sun finally rose, I already knew what I had to do. Early Monday morning, I drove through the lingering fog that hugged the harbor, the streets still quiet as fishing boats rocked gently in the distance. Portland always felt peaceful at that hour, as if the world hadn't fully woken up yet, but my pulse was loud in my ears. I arrived at the law office before anyone else. The leather chair in the waiting room felt colder than it should have, and I sat there with the black ledger pressed against my thigh, my fingers tracing the cracked edges of its cover. This building had seen decades of family decisions, property purchases, trusts, wills, but today it would witness something final. At exactly 8 o'clock, the door to the inner office opened. Mr. Bennett greeted me with a solemn nod. He had been my father's attorney for over 40 years. He had watched me grow up, had signed paperwork when my parents bought this house, and had helped my father structure the estate long before illness entered our lives. He didn't waste time with condolences. His eyes went straight to the documents in my hands. I placed the death certificate on his mahogany desk, followed by the durable power of attorney and executor papers. He adjusted his glasses and carefully examined every signature, every stamp. When he finished, he leaned back slightly and exhaled through his nose. "I'm sorry, Nan," he said quietly, "but you are now fully authorized." I nodded. Then I slid the ledger toward him. He opened it slowly. Page by page, his expression darkened. His jaw tightened when he saw the amounts. His brow furrowed at the annotations. He didn't comment until he reached the last entry just days before my father's death. He closed the book and shook his head. "That's substantial," he said carefully. "It's systematic," I replied, "and it ends today." We worked efficiently. I instructed him to immediately freeze all estate-linked accounts, cancel standing wire transfers that had been set up years ago to cover Heidi's rent and insurance, and notify every major financial institution tied to the family trust that no withdrawals or changes could be made without my direct biometric authorization. Each keystroke felt like a door quietly closing. The most surreal moment came when Mr. Bennett slid a repossession order across the desk. The luxury sports car Heidi had been driving registered under my father's name was legally estate property. If she refused to return it, it would be classified as stolen. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed. Mr. Bennett warned me that the backlash would be immediate and intense. He reminded me that Heidi had lived comfortably off this system for over a decade, and people rarely surrender privilege without violence or manipulation. I thanked him for his honesty. I've already survived 3 years of watching my father die, I told him. Whatever comes next can't be worse than that. When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air smelled faintly of salt water and wet pavement. I took one slow breath, letting the ocean wind brush against my face. For a brief moment, everything felt still. Then my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Heidi, I answered, holding the phone away from my ear. Her voice exploded through the speaker. What the hell did you do to my card? It just got declined at the hotel counter. Her scream was so sharp that a passerby turned to stare. I waited for her to finish. Then I spoke calmly. That was Dad's supplementary card. There was a pause. Then she doubled down. Turn it back on right now. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I swear, Nyan, I will come there and... You should be worrying about much bigger things than a hotel bill, I interrupted. Her breathing became erratic. Who do you think you are? You're just jealous because I actually have a life. I stared out at the harbor, watching a seagull glide low over the water. Heidi, I said quietly. Dad passed away. The silence on the line was brief, but it wasn't grief that followed. What? His bank is closed forever. I ended the call before she could respond and immediately blocked her number. I stood there for a moment, letting the phone rest against my palm. She hadn't asked how he died. She hadn't asked when the funeral was. She hadn't even asked why I was the one answering. All she cared about was her interrupted vacation. The realization didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. The next 2 days passed in a blur of administrative purgatory insurance forms, funeral invoices, estate notifications. I barely left the house. The silence pressed against me from every corner, and the rain outside never seemed to stop. By Wednesday afternoon, the isolation began to weigh on my chest. That's when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my best friend Claire standing on the welcome mat, holding a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. She didn't ask how I was doing. She simply stepped inside, set the food on the counter, and turned on the oven. She made me sit. She made me eat. She stayed long enough to ensure I was breathing like a human again before heading home to her own family. Her presence reminded me that not everyone leaves. Not everyone chooses champagne over graves. After she left, the house settled back into stillness. But somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't over. Because when you cut off someone who's been feeding freely for years, they don't walk away quietly. And as the rain continued to fall against the roof, I had the unsettling feeling that Heidi was already on her way back, angrier, desperate, and ready to take whatever she thought was hers. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. It drummed against the roof like a slow, relentless heartbeat, filling the house with a hollow echo that matched the way I felt inside. I spent most of that time buried in paperwork, signing documents, answering emails from insurance agents, and sorting through stacks of mail that had piled up while my father was sick. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. Grief doesn't always arrive in waves. Sometimes it settles quietly in your bones. By Wednesday afternoon, the isolation had started to press down on my chest. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a mug of cold coffee, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. I opened the door to find my best friend Claire standing on the porch, rain dripping from the edge of her coat. She held a casserole dish wrapped in foil, her expression firm and determined. She didn't ask how I was doing. She simply walked past me into the kitchen, set the dish on the counter, and turned on the oven like she owned the place. "Sit," she said gently. I obeyed. She served me a plate, made sure I took a few real bites, and stayed just long enough to remind me that I wasn't completely alone in the world. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Her presence was enough. After she left, the house fell silent again. I was rinsing dishes when I heard another knock, much softer this time. It was Mrs. Higgins, my longtime neighbor. She had lived next door for more than 30 years, long enough to remember when my mother was still alive, long enough to have watched Heidi and me grow up. She stood on the porch, clutching a small velvet box, her gray hair whipped around her face by the wind. I invited her inside. She sat on the floral sofa in the living room, hands trembling slightly as she rested the box on her lap. Her eyes looked tired, filled with something heavier than age. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. She explained that during the final months of my father's life, while I was inside managing medications or rushing to the pharmacy, he had developed a strange routine. Every evening, no matter how cold it was, he would drag his heavy armchair onto the front porch. She thought at first he just wanted fresh air, but he wasn't. He was waiting. He would sit there, staring down the driveway, watching every car that passed. Whenever a red vehicle appeared, his face would light up for a brief moment only to fall when it drove by. He kept saying Heidi promised she was coming home, Mrs. Higgins whispered, wiping her eyes. He waited every night. The image shattered something inside me. I had been so focused on keeping him alive that I had missed how deeply lonely he was. Mrs. Higgins slid the velvet box across the table toward me. "He asked me to hold on to this," she said softly. "It was supposed to be a surprise for your sister." Inside was a vintage gold watch. I recognized it immediately. It had been kept on the top shelf of his closet with his most important investment papers. Even after everything, he had planned to give Heidi a gift. Mrs. Higgins stood to leave, pausing at the door with a worried look. "I saw a strange car circling the block this morning," she added. "I just thought you should know." I thanked her and closed the door, my heart pounding harder than it had all day. That night, I barely slept. And just past noon on Friday, the storm finally arrived. I heard tires screech outside and looked through the bay window in time to see a yellow taxi swerve into the driveway. The engine cut abruptly. The passenger door flew open. Heidi stepped out. She dragged a massive designer suitcase behind her, its wheels scraping loudly against the concrete. Her dress was wrinkled from travel, and mascara streaked beneath eyes burning with manic intensity. She didn't ring the bell. She slammed her shoulder into the front door. It burst open with a crash that shook the picture frames on the wall. I was standing in the living room waiting for her. She didn't even glance at the small memorial table I had set up for our father. Her eyes locked onto mine like a predator spotting prey. She marched across the hardwood floor and raised her hand to strike me. I caught her wrist midair. Years of lifting medical equipment had strengthened my reflexes. I squeezed her forearm just enough to make her gasp and shoved her backward. She stumbled into the hallway table but regained her balance quickly, staring at me like she couldn't believe I had fought back. "What gives you the right to lock my accounts?" she screamed. "I'm the eldest daughter. I deserve half of everything." "You abandoned him," I said evenly. "You don't get to inherit guilt-free." She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh and began tearing through the house, ripping books from shelves, sweeping decorations onto the floor, searching for money that didn't exist. A porcelain vase my mother brought back from Italy shattered at my feet. She overturned chairs, dumped drawers, and kicked magazines across the room, shouting that I had hidden the cash. I didn't engage. I pulled out my phone, calmly dialed 911, and told her she had 3 minutes to leave before the police arrived for trespassing and destruction of property. Color drained from her face. She grabbed her purse, hauled the suitcase outside, and screamed obscenities down the driveway as she left. I locked the door behind her with shaking hands. The house was wrecked. Memories lay broken across the floor, but the storm had passed for now. Early Saturday morning, I woke to gentle tapping. I looked through the peephole. Heidi stood on the porch, wrapped in a thin cardigan, face scrubbed clean of makeup, eyes wide and watery. She looked small, vulnerable. I opened the door with the security chain still fastened. She launched into an apology, blaming stress, medication, and a failed business deal in Miami. She claimed panic had made her lose control. She reached toward me through the narrow opening. "We're all we have left," she pleaded. "Please let me in." Then she tried to rewrite history. "I helped with Dad's bills," she said softly. "You're just jealous he loved me more." I stared at her. "The ledger says you never sent a single cent," I replied. Her expression changed instantly. The sorrow vanished. Her posture straightened. She leaned closer and whispered cruelly, "You're 32, alone, no husband, No kids. You gave up everything for him while I was living my life." For a moment, her words landed. Then I saw my father sitting on the porch, staring down an empty road, and I understood. She wasn't living his dream. She was his heartbreak. I didn't argue. I simply closed the door. The deadbolt clicked into place. And as I walked away, I knew this was no longer about money. It was about finally choosing peace over someone who had never chosen us. The silence after I closed the door on Heidi felt different from all the other silences that had filled this house. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was heavy. I leaned my forehead against the wood for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of her suitcase wheels scraping down the driveway, then to the taxi pulling away. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the emotional exhaustion of finally standing up to someone who had spent most of my life stepping on me. The living room looked like a crime scene. Broken porcelain glittered across the carpet. Books lay scattered like fallen leaves. A chair was overturned near the window. Every object felt like a memory that had been violently displaced. I didn't clean it right away. Instead, I sat on the edge of the couch and let the reality settle into my bones. This was what grief looked like after betrayal. Later that evening, I walked through the house slowly, gathering fragments of what she had destroyed. I placed my mother's shattered vase into a cardboard box, one delicate piece at a time. I stacked fallen books back onto shelves. I righted the furniture. With every small act of restoration, I felt myself reclaiming space, not just physically, but emotionally. By Sunday morning, I had reached a strange kind of calm. I knew Heidi wasn't finished. People like her never leave quietly when control slips through their fingers. So, when Mr. Bennett called that afternoon to tell me Heidi had retained legal counsel and formally requested a meeting to discuss the estate, I wasn't surprised. The appointment was set for Tuesday. 2 days. I spent those 48 hours preparing. I organized every document my father had left behind. I printed bank statements, sorted the ledger entries by date, and created folders for medical records, property titles, and correspondence. Late Monday night, while reviewing old files from the study, I found something I hadn't been actively looking for, but which made my stomach tighten the moment I saw it. Several tax documents. They were Heidi's. She had carelessly left copies behind during one of her rare visits years ago. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. But now, with everything else in front of me, I started reading more carefully, and that's when I noticed the inconsistencies. She had listed our father as her dependent. She had claimed head of household status. She had reported that she was providing more than half of his financial support. Every year, for 5 years, my hands went cold. She hadn't just drained him emotionally. She had been using him on paper, too. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. Tuesday afternoon arrived with an oppressive stillness. The conference room at Mr. Bennett's firm was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I sat at the long mahogany table, my hands folded over a thick manila folder, waiting. The glass door opened. Heidi walked in wearing a conservative black dress, her hair neatly styled, grief carefully painted onto her face. She avoided looking at me and took a seat across the table. A man in an ill-fitting gray suit followed behind her, introduced himself as her attorney, and placed a worn briefcase beside his chair. They didn't offer condolences. They didn't ask how I was holding up. Her lawyer immediately slid a document toward Mr. Bennett. He cleared his throat. "My client is requesting an equal division of all estate assets," he announced, 50-50, including the residence. He continued, claiming that my father had not been of sound mind when he finalized the estate documents and suggesting I had exerted undue influence during his final months. I watched Heidi smirk faintly, as if she had already won. Mr. Bennett calmly produced a certified letter from my father's physician, stating clearly that he was fully lucid and competent until the day he died. The opposing attorney waved it away. "If necessary," he said, "we're prepared to take this to probate court and litigate for as long as it takes." I understood what he was implying. Legal battles are expensive. Heidi assumed I would fold. She thought I couldn't afford to fight. She didn't know what I had in my folder. I gently placed my hand on Mr. Bennett's arm, signaling that I wanted to speak. Then I opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. They were Heidi's tax returns. Her attorney picked them up, confused at first. Then his expression changed. He scanned the pages more closely, his lips parting slightly. I spoke quietly. You declared to federal authorities that you were directly supporting our father financially. You claimed thousands in annual refunds based on that statement. Heidi's face drained of color. Her lawyer looked up at her sharply. You never told me about this, he said, his voice tight. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. This is serious, he continued. This isn't a civil matter. He pushed his chair back. I won't represent you in something that involves misrepresentation to government agencies. He gathered his papers quickly, avoiding Heidi's eyes. The room fell silent. I leaned forward slightly. I don't want revenge, I said calmly. I want closure. I slid one final document toward her. If you sign this, you waive all rights to the estate. You walk away. We never speak again. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling. And if I don't, she whispered, then I submit everything I have, and whatever happens next won't be in my control. She signed. She stood up on unsteady legs and left without looking back. I stayed seated for a long time after the door closed, not because I felt victorious, but because something heavy had finally lifted. I didn't feel victorious when Heidi walked out of that conference room. I felt empty. Not the hollow kind of empty that grief brings, but the quiet kind that follows a storm, when the air feels heavy and still, and you're left standing among the wreckage wondering what comes next. Mr. Bennett gathered the remaining documents and gave me a small nod. He didn't congratulate me. He simply said, "You did what your father trusted you to do." I thanked him, walked outside, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, letting the cool spring air fill my lungs. The harbor was visible down the street, fishing boats drifting slowly in the distance. Life was continuing, indifferent to family wars and legal endings. Mine, however, had just changed. Spring arrived late that year in Portland. The snow lingered stubbornly along the edges of sidewalks, and the trees took their time budding. But one morning, I noticed the first purple crocuses pushing through the thawed soil in the front yard. It felt symbolic, fragile, quiet, proof that something new was beginning. I decided the house needed to change. Not just cleaned, reclaimed. I stripped the dark wallpaper from the hallway that had absorbed so many nights of whispered pain and replaced it with soft cream paint that reflected sunlight instead of sorrow. I cleared out my father's study, packed away his old magazines and paperwork, and transformed the space into a small design office. For the first time in 3 years, I unrolled blueprints again. I reopened my freelance architecture business, taking on modest projects at first. Each draft, each client meeting, each carefully measured line on tracing paper felt like I was stitching myself back together. The room that once smelled of old paper and secrets now smelled of fresh ink and possibility. News about Heidi reached me through distant acquaintances and former friends of the family. I didn't seek it out. But in small towns, stories travel quietly. Her luxury condo with the ocean view was gone. The sports car was repossessed. Her credit lines evaporated. She had moved out of Miami and was working overnight shifts at a roadside diner somewhere off the interstate because no reputable company wanted to hire someone with unresolved legal complications hanging over her name. What struck me most wasn't her sudden poverty. It was how quickly the artificial shine faded. People said she looked older, tired in a way makeup couldn't hide. Without the expensive treatments and curated social media image, she seemed to shrink into herself. The audience she had lived for disappeared overnight. She finally understood what it meant to stand alone. And for once, it wasn't me. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I let it be. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the freshly painted front porch with Mrs. Higgins, sipping chamomile tea while we watched the rhododendrons begin to bloom in the garden. The same spot where my father had once sat every evening, waiting for a red car that never arrived, now held quiet conversation and gentle laughter. Mrs. Higgins patted my hand and smiled. "The house feels alive again," she said. "Your father would have liked that." I nodded. I thought of him often, of his patience, his quiet strength, the way he endured disappointment without bitterness. I hoped, wherever he was, that he could feel the peace settling back into this place. Later that evening, as sunlight faded behind the trees, I stood alone in the living room holding the black leather ledger for the last time. It felt lighter now, not because the pages weighed less, but because the power they once held over me had finally loosened. I carried it to the fireplace. For a moment, I hesitated. Those pages contained years of sacrifice, betrayal, and silence. They told the story of a father who loved too deeply and a daughter who took too freely. But they also represented something else, a chapter of my life that was finished. I struck a match. The flame caught slowly at the corner of the paper, curling the ink into soft black ash. I placed the ledger on the logs and watched as the fire consumed it page by page, lie by lie, dollar by dollar. Smoke rose up the chimney, carrying away a history I no longer needed to hold. I stood there until the leather cover collapsed inward, and there was nothing left but glowing embers. In that moment, I understood that true freedom had never been about money or inheritance. It was about peace. It was about honoring my father's final wishes without losing myself in the process. It was about choosing to move forward instead of staying trapped in someone else's dysfunction. The silence in the house no longer felt lonely. It felt open, like a blank canvas. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home. I was already there. The fire eventually burned itself down to embers, leaving behind nothing but warmth and a faint scent of smoke in the living room. I stood there for a long time after the last page of the ledger disappeared, watching the orange glow fade into soft gray ash. It felt strange, letting go of something that had carried so much weight. For years, that book had represented everything I couldn't say out loud, every sacrifice my father made, every lie my sister told, every dollar that left this house. The love slowly drained from it. Now it was gone, and somehow, so was the heaviness in my chest. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still mornings when I woke up reaching for my phone, instinctively ready to check on Dad, before remembering he was gone. There were nights when the house felt too quiet, when I missed the sound of his cough from down the hallway, or the way he used to call my name when he couldn't sleep. Grief doesn't leave all at once. It comes in smaller waves. But the difference now was that I wasn't drowning in it anymore. I started building a new routine. I took early walks along the harbor, letting the cold air wake me up properly. I cooked real meals instead of surviving on coffee and toast. I accepted more design clients, slowly filling my calendar again, rediscovering the version of myself that existed before hospitals and medication schedules consumed everything. Some evenings, I sat on the porch alone with a blanket over my shoulders, watching cars pass by on the quiet street. I thought about how my father used to sit in that same spot, waiting for someone who never came. I promised myself I would never wait like that again. People eventually stopped bringing up Heidi. At first, neighbors asked gently how she was doing. Then the questions faded. Her name became something people avoided out of politeness, like a topic that had lost its relevance. I didn't offer updates. I didn't feel the need to explain. She had made her choices. So had I. What surprised me most was how much peace came from simply refusing to engage anymore. No more defending myself. No more replaying arguments in my head. No more wondering if I had been too harsh or not harsh enough. I had drawn a line, and on this side of that line, there was quiet. One afternoon, while organizing old photos in the hallway, I found a picture of Heidi and me as children. We were standing in front of this very house, arms slung awkwardly around each other, both missing front teeth, smiling at the camera like nothing in the world could ever pull us apart. I held the photo for a moment, then I placed it back in the box. Not because I hated her, but because I finally understood something important. You can love someone and still walk away. You can share blood with someone and still protect yourself from them. Family isn't defined by genetics. It's defined by presence. By who shows up when life becomes unbearable. By who sits beside you in hospital rooms. By who answers the phone in the middle of the night. By who stands next to you at funerals, even when the wind is brutal and the ground is frozen. Real love doesn't post captions. It holds hands. My father taught me that without ever saying it directly. He taught me through patience, through endurance, through quiet acts of care that went unnoticed by the person they were meant for. He also taught me, in the end, that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you. He gave me the tools to protect what mattered, and I used them. Sometimes, I replay that final meeting in my mind, the way Heidi's confidence collapsed when she realized her own paperwork had betrayed her. The way her lawyer stepped back, unwilling to follow her any further. The way her signature trembled on that page. I don't feel satisfaction when I think about it. I feel closure. I didn't win. I survived. And there's a difference. On quiet Sundays now, Mrs. Higgins still comes over for tea. We talk about gardening, neighborhood gossip, and occasionally about my father. She tells me he would be proud of how I've rebuilt my life, how I chose dignity over drama. I like to believe she's right. I've learned that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over being understood. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding a room, repainting walls, and turning grief into something useful. I honored my father's legacy not by holding on to money, but by holding on to integrity. And in doing so, I finally reclaimed myself. If there's one lesson I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it's this. Sharing DNA does not give anyone permission to mistreat you. Loyalty is not owed to people who disappear when you need them most. And forgiveness does not require you to reopen doors that nearly destroyed you. Love is measured by presence, not by promises, not by social media posts, not by who shows up when there's something to gain, but by who stays when everything hurts. I often wonder what you would have done in my place. Would you have drawn such a hard boundary with your own sibling? Would you have taken legal steps to protect what your parent left behind? Or would you have tried to keep the peace, even if it meant losing yourself in the process? There's no single right answer, but I know this choosing yourself is not selfish. It's survival, and sometimes it's the bravest thing you'll ever do. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Your time truly means more than you know. If this journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, boundaries, and quiet justice, please consider subscribing to Revenge Drama House. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I'm grateful you were here to listen to mine. Before we close this chapter, I want to take a quiet moment to reflect on what this story truly represents. This was never just a tale about inheritance or legal battles. At its core, it was a story about presence, about who stays when life becomes unbearable, and who disappears when there's nothing left to take. It reminds us that family isn't defined by blood, but by actions. Real love doesn't show up in Instagram captions or luxury vacations. It shows up in hospital rooms, in sleepless nights, and in silent sacrifices that no one applauds. Nyan's journey teaches us something powerful. Choosing yourself is not betrayal. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. And protecting your peace is sometimes the bravest form of love you can offer to yourself and to those who truly mattered. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own struggles, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter, and this community grows stronger when we learn from one another. Thank you for spending your time here with Revenge Drama House. If you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, justice, and emotional healing, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us. Your support means everything, and we're grateful you're part of this journey.